I had just finished feeding my backyard chickens when I heard the unmistakable sound of heels clicking aggressively on my driveway. I sighed, already knowing who it was before I even turned around. Sure enough, there stood Karren, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, arms crossed, her face twisted in a look of pure entitlement. "Yaroslav," she started, her voice dripping with fake politeness. "We need to talk." I wiped my hands on my jeans and leaned against the fence. "Do we?" She pulled a neatly folded paper from her purse and shoved it toward me. "You've been fined. Backyard livestock is strictly against HOA regulations." I barely glanced at it before handing it back. "Karren, these chickens have been here for over a year. No one's complained until now. And besides, I checked the bylaws before I got them. There's nothing about chickens." Her lips thinned. "The rules have recently been updated." Of course, they had. Karren and her little HOA goons loved pulling nonsense like this, quietly changing rules and then slapping homeowners with fines like they were doing us a favor. I took a slow breath, keeping my temper in check. "Updated when?" She hesitated for half a second. "Last week." I almost laughed. "And when was the notice sent out?" She pursed her lips. "It's not my job to keep track of who reads updates. The rule is in effect, and you are in violation." I crossed my arms. "So, let me get this straight. You changed the rule last week, didn't notify anyone, and now you're fining me?" She lifted her chin. "It's your responsibility to stay informed." I had dealt with HOA nonsense before, but this was a new level of ridiculous. "You have 72 hours to remove them," she continued, "or we'll escalate the matter." I chuckled. "You mean you'll keep sending me more fines?" "Go ahead, Karren. Let's see how that works out for you." Her eyes narrowed. "I suggest you take this seriously, Yaroslav. The HOA has the power to place a lien on your property if you refuse to pay." I gave her a long, slow stare. "You really think I'm going to just roll over and let you pull this?" She gave me the kind of smile a snake might give before striking. "You'll learn that fighting the HOA never ends well." I watched as she strutted back down my driveway, feeling the slow burn of anger settle in my stomach. Fine. If Karren wanted a battle, she was going to get one. And I already had the perfect plan. I didn't waste any time after Karren left. If she thought she could railroad me with a shady rule change, she was in for a rude awakening. I grabbed my laptop and went straight to work, pulling up the HOA's bylaws from the official homeowner portal. I scrolled carefully, checking every section related to property regulations. Just as I suspected, there was no mention of backyard chickens anywhere. Then I checked the meeting minutes posted online. The last documented meeting had been over a month ago, and there was no record of any new rule addressing livestock. That meant one of two things: either Karren and her cronies had made this decision outside of an official meeting, or they had failed to document it properly. Either way, it was a procedural mess, and I was going to use it against them. I decided to dig further. If the HOA had legitimately changed the rules, they were required to notify homeowners in writing. I checked my email, my physical mail, and even the HOA's community message board. Nothing. No announcements, no updates. That alone was grounds to challenge the fine. But I wasn't just going to challenge it, I was going to make an example out of Karren. The next morning, I called up a friend of mine, Luis, who happened to be a real estate attorney. After explaining the situation, he immediately confirmed that the HOA was in violation of its own rules. If they wanted to enforce a new restriction, they had to follow proper procedures, including a vote and official homeowner notification. Since none of that had happened, the rule was worthless. Luis laughed when he heard my plan. "This is going to be good," he said. "Just make sure you document everything." I assured him I would. Then I got to work setting up my counterattack. First, I printed out the HOA's bylaws, highlighting the sections that required official documentation for rule changes. Then, I gathered screenshots of the online meeting minutes, proving there had been no mention of a livestock ban. Finally, I drafted a letter formally disputing the fine and demanding proof of the rule's legitimacy. With my evidence in hand, I sent copies to the HOA board and made sure to post a notice on the community forum, letting my neighbors know about the situation. If Karren thought she could sneak in rule changes without anyone noticing, she was about to get a reality check. But I wasn't done yet. I had something even bigger planned. I spent the next few days quietly spreading the word. I spoke to neighbors who also kept backyard chickens, letting them know what Karren was trying to pull. I found others who had been hit with questionable fines recently, and together, we started gathering complaints. Then I set my plan into motion. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for Friday evening, and I made sure to attend. But I wasn't coming alone. By the time I arrived at the community center, the parking lot was packed. Inside, the usual HOA board members sat at the front, Karren in the middle, looking smug as ever. She barely glanced at me as she shuffled her papers, clearly expecting this to be just another routine meeting where she called the shots. She had no idea what was coming. The moment the floor was opened for homeowner concerns, I stood up. I could feel the energy in the room shift as people turned to listen. Karren gave me an impatient look, but I ignored her. I cleared my throat. Before we begin, I'd like to address the recent fines issued for backyard chickens. Karren's expression tightened. This isn't the time. I held up a stack of printed documents. Actually, it is. According to the HOA bylaws, no new rule can be enforced without proper notification and documentation. As you can see here, there is no record of an official vote or announcement regarding any livestock ban. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some of my neighbors nodded, clearly aware of what was happening. I continued. Furthermore, I have contacted legal counsel, who confirmed that this fine is unenforceable. The HOA cannot retroactively punish homeowners for a rule that was never properly enacted. Karren's face darkened. This is not up for debate. The board has full authority to amend regulations as needed. I smiled. Actually, no. Any amendment must be passed through a formal meeting with documented minutes. Since that never happened, this rule of yours holds no legal weight. A few people in the audience chuckled. Karren's grip tightened on her papers, but I wasn't finished. I stepped aside, and that's when the real spectacle began. The doors at the back of the room opened, and in walked several of my neighbors, each of them leading a live chicken on a small harness or carrying a crate with a hen inside. There were at least a dozen birds in total, clucking and ruffling their feathers as they were brought to the front. Gasps and laughter broke out among the crowd. Some people pulled out their phones, recording the scene as Karren's face turned an alarming shade of red. I gestured to the birds. Since this meeting is apparently about chickens, I figured we might as well turn it into an opportunity. Welcome to the first ever HOA livestock auction. The room erupted. People cheered and clapped, while others laughed at the sheer absurdity of the situation. Even a few board members looked amused. Karren, however, was furious. This is completely inappropriate. You cannot bring animals into a board meeting. I raised an eyebrow. There's no rule against it. She sputtered, but before she could regain control, one of my neighbors, an older gentleman named Mr. Thompson, stepped forward. I'll start the bidding at $20 for that Rhode Island red. More laughter. Another neighbor raised their hand. 30. Karren slammed her hand on the table. Enough. This meeting is adjourned. But it was too late. The entire room had turned against her. People continued jokingly placing bids, and a few even pulled out cash, playing along with the impromptu auction. I leaned against the podium, watching Karren struggle to maintain control. She had spent years bullying homeowners with arbitrary fines and ridiculous rules. But tonight, she had finally lost her grip. Before she could storm out, I called out, "By the way, since the rule wasn't properly enacted, I expect all fines related to backyard chickens to be rescinded immediately." The remaining board members, seeing the writing on the wall, reluctantly nodded. Karren, still fuming, turned on her heel and marched out of the room, leaving behind a crowd still buzzing with laughter. As I packed up my things, several neighbors came up to thank me. The message was clear: Karren's reign of unchecked power was crumbling, and the community was ready to push back. And as for my chickens, they weren't going anywhere. After the chaotic HOA meeting, word spread fast through the neighborhood. People who had never dared to challenge the board before were suddenly emboldened. It was as if a dam had broken, and now everyone had something to say about Karren and her reign of nonsense. The next morning, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee, watching as neighbors walked by, offering approving nods or giving me a thumbs up. A few even stopped to chat, sharing their own grievances about the HOA's heavy-handed tactics. Then came the best part. Luis, my attorney friend, had advised me to file an official complaint against the HOA with the state's Homeowner Protection Board. He helped me draft a detailed report outlining Karren's unauthorized rule changes, lack of proper documentation, and the pattern of unfair fines. I had gathered plenty of statements from neighbors who had been targeted in similar ways, and as soon as I submitted the complaint, I made sure Karren knew about it. I didn't have to wait long for her reaction. By noon, a black SUV pulled up to my driveway. The passenger door swung open, and out stepped Karren, her expression a storm of barely contained fury. She was dressed in a crisp blazer, clutching a leather-bound folder like it was a weapon. I stayed seated, sipping my coffee as she marched up. She stopped just short of my porch. Her voice was tight. "We need to talk." I gestured to the empty chair beside me. "Feel free." She ignored the offer. "I received notice that an official complaint has been filed against the HOA. I nodded. "Sounds about right." Her grip on the folder tightened. "This is a serious matter. Do you have any idea what kind of trouble you're stirring up?" I raised an eyebrow. "Trouble?"
No.
"Accountability?" "Yes." She exhaled sharply. "The HOA is responsible for maintaining order in this community. Your little stunt. Exposing illegal rule changes isn't a stunt," I interrupted. "It's called due process." Her eyes darkened. "If you think this is going to destroy me, you're mistaken." I shrugged. "Destroy?"
No.
"But it will force you to follow the rules like everyone else." She opened the folder and pulled out another document. "We're rescinding the chicken fines. Effective immediately." I took the paper from her, scanning it quickly. It was exactly what I had expected. No apology, no admission of wrongdoing, just a begrudging acknowledgement that they had no choice but to back down. I folded the paper and set it on the table. "Good. But that's not enough." Her nostrils flared. "Excuse me?" I leaned forward. "The HOA needs to issue a formal correction, not just to me, but to everyone who received an unjust fine. And while we're at it, I think it's time for a full audit of the board's activities over the past year." Her jaw clenched. "That's not going to happen." I tilted my head. "Then I guess the State Review Board will have to decide." Her expression flickered just for a second with something close to panic. Then she plastered on a fake smile. "You're making this personal." I laughed. "Karren, you made it personal the moment you tried to fine me for a rule that didn't exist." For the first time, she didn't have a response. She turned on her heel and strode back to her SUV. As she drove off, I could already see the cracks forming. She had lost this battle, but I had a feeling she wasn't done trying to cling to power. Fine by me, because I wasn't done either. The fallout from the HOA meeting spread like wildfire. Karren's authority had taken a serious hit, and it was clear she was scrambling to regain control. Over the next few days, I noticed her and a few of her closest board members making house calls, knocking on doors, trying to do damage control. But the neighborhood wasn't having it. People had seen her exposed for what she was, and now that they knew they had the power to stand up to her, they weren't backing down. I had expected her to retaliate, but even I wasn't prepared for how far she was willing to go. It started subtly. First, my trash pickup mysteriously stopped. The garbage truck came down my street like clockwork every week, but somehow they skipped my house. I called the company, and after some back and forth, they admitted they had been told by the community association that my service was suspended due to non-payment. I had my receipts proving otherwise, and when I pressed them further, they promised to reinstate it immediately. Then, the city inspector showed up at my door, claiming they had received a report about unsanitary conditions in my backyard. The guy was polite enough, but it was clear he was just doing his job. I showed him around, let him check the chicken coop, and after a brief inspection, he shrugged and told me everything looked fine. Still, it was obvious what was happening. Karren was trying to make my life difficult, hoping I'd either back down or slip up. That wasn't going to happen. I decided to take the fight a step further. I wasn't just going to defend myself, I was going to dismantle her entire operation. I spent the next few days digging. I went through every HOA document I could get my hands on, looking for inconsistencies, financial discrepancies, anything that could expose her corruption. What I found was worse than I expected. The HOA had been collecting special assessment fees from homeowners for the past 2 years, supposedly to fund repairs for the neighborhood's shared amenities, the clubhouse, the pool, and the walking trails. Except, when I checked the HOA's financial statements, the money wasn't adding up. The reserve fund was suspiciously low, and several payments had been made to companies that didn't seem to exist. That wasn't just negligence, that was embezzlement. I reached out to a few neighbors who had served on the board in the past, asking if they knew anything about these payments. One of them, an older woman named Margaret, told me she had resigned from the board last year after Karren started making unilateral financial decisions without consulting the other members. Margaret had tried to raise concerns, but Karren had shut her down, insisting that she had everything under control. Now, it was clear what was really going on. I compiled all the evidence I had, then sent it to Luis. He reviewed everything, and after a few hours, he called me with a simple conclusion. Karren wasn't just bending the rules, she was breaking the law. With his help, I filed an official complaint with the state's HOA Oversight Committee and sent a copy of the financial discrepancies to the County Fraud Division. But I didn't stop there. I made sure the entire neighborhood knew. Late one evening, I printed out detailed breakdowns of the missing funds, highlighting the suspicious payments and the lack of transparency. I slid copies under every doorstep, posted them on the community bulletin board, and even sent an email blast to every homeowner in the neighborhood. By the next morning, Karren's house was surrounded by angry residents demanding answers. I stayed back, watching from my porch as she tried to fend them off with her usual condescending tone, insisting that it was all a misunderstanding. But people weren't buying it anymore. Then, the real hammer dropped. A few days later, a pair of investigators from the county auditor's office showed up at the HOA office. They spent hours combing through records, interviewing board members, and reviewing financial statements. By the end of the day, Karren was seen leaving the office with a strained expression, her usual smug confidence nowhere to be found. That evening, an emergency HOA meeting was called. This time, Karren wasn't in charge. The board had no choice but to address the allegations. The investigators had found enough evidence to warrant further action, and Karren was officially suspended pending the outcome of the investigation. The remaining board members, realizing they had been complicit in her schemes, started scrambling to distance themselves. But the community wasn't going to let them off that easily. A vote was held right then and there to remove the entire board and elect new members. I didn't put my name in the running, but I made sure to support neighbors who genuinely wanted to fix the damage Karren had done. By the end of the night, a new board was in place, and their first order of business was simple: audit everything. As for Karren, she tried to fight back, but it was too late. The fraud division completed its review, and the findings were damning. Thousands of dollars in HOA funds had been funneled into fake maintenance contracts, with the payments leading back to accounts linked to her relatives. She was arrested a few weeks later, charged with fraud, embezzlement, and financial misconduct. The neighborhood slowly started to heal. The ridiculous fines stopped, the unnecessary rules were rolled back, and for the first time in years, homeowners actually had a say in how their community was run. And my chickens? Still happily clucking in my backyard, untouched and unbothered. With Karren gone, the neighborhood began to feel different. People were more relaxed, actually talking to one another instead of just exchanging wary nods. The new HOA board wasted no time in dismantling the nonsense rules Karren had imposed over the years. They revised the bylaws to prevent any future board members from making unilateral decisions, enforced financial transparency policies, and even reversed dozens of bogus fines that had been issued under Karren's leadership. It felt like a victory, and for the most part, it was. But just because Karren was removed didn't mean everything was fixed overnight. There were still remnants of her influence lingering in the community, people who had benefited from her corruption, or simply enjoyed the control she exerted. And some of them weren't happy about the changes. One of them was Greg, Karren's closest ally on the former board. While the rest of the ousted members had slunk away quietly, Greg still walked around like he owned the place, acting as if the new board was temporary and things would go back to the way they had been. He made a habit of checking in on people, showing up unannounced to offer unsolicited advice about how they should maintain their properties. I personally caught him snooping around my backyard one afternoon, pretending to admire my garden while clearly looking for something to report. I didn't say anything to him at the time. I just stood there, arms crossed, watching until he got uncomfortable and left. But I knew he wasn't done trying to stir things up. It wasn't long before he started spreading rumors. At the next community gathering, I overheard him telling a small group of homeowners that the new board was in over their heads and that the neighborhood was going downhill. He claimed property values would plummet, that the lack of strict oversight would lead to chaos, and that it was only a matter of time before people regretted voting Karren out. I let him talk. I knew that the best way to deal with people like Greg wasn't to argue, it was to wait for them to expose themselves. And it didn't take long for that to happen. One afternoon, a neighbor named Olivia knocked on my door. She was holding a letter she had just received from an anonymous sender, claiming that the new board was mismanaging funds and that a concerned group of homeowners was pushing for a leadership change. The letter was filled with vague accusations, warning that if people didn't take action soon, the neighborhood would be in financial ruin. I read it twice, then looked up at Olivia. She was clearly uneasy. She told me that several other neighbors had received the same letter, and some of them were actually starting to believe it. The timing was no coincidence. The HOA was in the middle of reviewing the finances left behind by Karren, and people were still waiting for the full report on just how much money had been stolen. Greg was trying to create doubt before the truth came out. I thanked Olivia and told her not to worry, I had a plan. That evening, I met with members of the new board and showed them the letter. They weren't surprised, but they were frustrated. They had been working nonstop to clean up the mess Karren had left behind, and now they had to deal with Greg trying to undermine them. Instead of getting defensive, we decided to fight back with facts. The next weekend, the board hosted a community meeting, but this one was different. Instead of the usual dry discussions about budgets and maintenance, they prepared a full presentation detailing everything they had uncovered about the past board's financial mismanagement. They laid out exactly how much money had been diverted into suspicious accounts, how Karren had manipulated contracts to benefit herself, and how Greg had personally approved several of those shady deals. The reaction was immediate. People were furious not at the new board, but at Greg. Homeowners who had once trusted him turned on him in an instant, demanding answers. Greg tried to deny everything, but the evidence was undeniable. By the time the meeting ended, Greg had lost whatever influence he had left. People who had once whispered in agreement with him now avoided eye contact. He didn't say a word as he left the meeting, his face pale and his usual confidence completely gone. With him discredited, things finally started to settle down. The HOA continued making improvements, and the community slowly regained trust in the leadership. The pool renovations that had been delayed due to Karren's financial mismanagement were finally completed, the walking trails were repaired, and homeowners actually had a say in decisions that affected them. As for me, I went back to living my life. My chickens enjoyed their peaceful backyard, and I no longer had to worry about someone trying to find me over non-existent rules. One evening, as I sat outside watching the sunset, Olivia stopped by again. She had a satisfied look on her face as she told me that Greg had officially put his house on the market. He was leaving, unable to deal with the fact that he had lost control. I couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. Karren's reign had ended. Greg's attempts to bring back the old ways had failed. And the community had learned an important lesson: when people stood together, they could take back control from those who tried to abuse it. I raised my glass in a quiet toast to the neighborhood's future. For the first time in years, it actually looked bright. With Greg gone, and the HOA finally in competent hands, the neighborhood felt like an entirely different place. The air seemed lighter, conversations were friendlier, and for the first time in years, people actually felt like they had a voice in how things were run. The absurd fines stopped, and the ridiculous rules Karren had imposed were slowly stripped away. The new board prioritized transparency, holding open meetings where homeowners could ask questions and get real answers instead of vague legal threats. But, despite the peace settling over the community, there was still one final loose end to tie up. The financial audit of the HOA's records had been slow and meticulous. While Karren had already been arrested for fraud and embezzlement, there were still lingering questions about where all the money had gone. The board had hired a forensic accountant to track every dollar, and the results had finally come in. The numbers were staggering. Over the course of 5 years, Karren had siphoned off tens of thousands of dollars from the HOA's funds. A significant portion had gone into personal expenses, vacation trips disguised as community outreach, luxury purchases under the guise of office supplies, and even payments to a non-existent landscaping company that turned out to be linked to her nephew. But the part that truly shocked everyone was the discovery of an off-the-books slush fund, where excess HOA fees had been funneled for emergency discretionary spending. Except there had never been an emergency. When the board presented these findings at the next community meeting, the room was packed. Homeowners who had spent years struggling under Karren's rule wanted to know exactly how much had been stolen from them. As the numbers were revealed, outrage spread like wildfire. Some people had suspected she was corrupt, but seeing the hard evidence in black and white made it undeniable. The question then became, what now? The board proposed legal action to recover the stolen funds, but lawsuits were expensive and time-consuming. Some suggested raising HOA dues temporarily to cover the legal costs, but that idea was immediately shot down. After everything the community had been through, no one was willing to pay a cent more than they already had. That's when I had an idea. Standing up, I reminded everyone that Karren had used HOA money for personal gain. So, why not turn her own tactics against her? If she had used HOA funds to buy expensive furniture, electronics, and other high-end items, then those things technically belong to the community. And if they belong to the community, they could be sold. The board agreed. Within a week, a full inventory of Karren's seized assets was compiled. The county had already repossessed her house, and everything inside was being held as part of the fraud investigation. After some legal maneuvering, the HOA was able to claim partial ownership over anything that had been purchased with stolen funds. That included designer furniture, high-end appliances, and even a brand new golf cart she had apparently justified as a community patrol vehicle. And so, we organized the neighborhood's biggest event, yet a massive auction, open to all homeowners. On the day of the auction, the turnout was overwhelming. People came from all over the neighborhood, some out of curiosity, others eager to reclaim a small piece of what had been taken from them. The atmosphere was lively, with families laughing and chatting as they browsed through the absurd collection of Karren's ill-gotten gains. The bidding wars were fierce. The fancy leather office chair she had used to lord over HOA meetings went for a ridiculous sum, mostly because people enjoyed the poetic justice of taking it from her. The overpriced espresso machine she had insisted was for board meetings found a new home in the hands of a neighbor who had once been fined for having a coffee cart on his porch. And the golf cart? That became the highlight of the event. Two neighbors, who had both been victims of Karren's ridiculous fines, got into a bidding war over it. But instead of trying to outbid each other, they came to an agreement buy it together and turn it into a community vehicle, available for anyone who needed a quick ride around the neighborhood. By the end of the day, every single item had been sold, and the HOA had recouped more than they ever expected. The funds were immediately allocated to reversing some of the financial damage Karren had caused. The broken security gate at the community entrance was finally fixed, the long-neglected playground got the repairs it desperately needed, and the clubhouse, once a symbol of Karren's unchecked control, was repainted and reopened for actual community events instead of just HOA meetings. As the sun set on the auction, I stood back and watched as families gathered around the newly restored common areas, talking and laughing like a true community. The neighborhood had been through so much, but in the end, we had come out stronger. Karren had spent years ruling through fear and manipulation, thinking she was untouchable. But in the end, her own greed had been her downfall. And as I walked back to my house, where my chickens clucked contentedly in the backyard, I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction. The neighborhood was finally free,